Welcome, everybody, to the Seen and Heard podcast, a conversational series. I have a great privilege today of being joined by the real David Cameron. David is someone who is not short of experience. He has worked as a teacher and as a school leader. He has been an advisor, a head of education for one of the Scottish local authorities, and director of children's services for another. He has been involved in national work in Scotland in a whole range of areas for many decades. For the last 15 years, he has been working as the real David Cameron, delivering presentations, training consultancy, and mentoring across the UK and internationally. He is also involved with two fantastic podcasts, the Rethinking Education podcast he co-hosts with Dr. James Mannion, and the Taking Action podcast he hosts, both available on platforms such as Apple, Spotify, and more. We'll put the links in the show notes. Welcome, David.
Thank you. Lovely to be here, Chris.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And thanks for persevering with diarising and technical stuff and all that. And I'm just really pleased you stuck with it and it could be here today. So thanks.
Not at all.
Yeah, cool. Well, I will start just by kind of letting people listening know how we made the connection. And the wonderful Suzanne Zedite, who's brilliant developmental psychologist, child psychologist, and works a lot in the Scottish ACEs community, Adverse Childhood Experiences community, and via her platform Connected Baby. So she put us in touch as just perhaps two like-minded people in many areas who want better for children. So I think it was through her, wasn't it?
It was indeed. Yeah. Suzanne's great for that. She's really aware of connection, both in terms of adverse childhood experiences and more generally. And she's very generous in terms of the connection she makes. So, yeah, always grateful for that.
Yeah, thank you. And it's cool that we ended up then sort of weaving our way around. And when I interviewed Dr. James Mannion for a podcast the other week, of course, you and he collaborate on the one that you do with him, Rethinking Education. So it's a small world, but a lot of people now really seeing the need for some change and bringing their experience, their lives to making that happen. So thank you. And I'd love to start just get a sense of kind of who you are and where you came from, really. So early years stuff. How was it for you growing up? And what's your background?
Well, my background is a bit of a mystery to me, really. I'm currently actually involved in trying to find out a bit more about it. My mother was effectively a single parent for me. My father, a really interesting man, who had a really impressive war record in Second World War. He then become a local councillor. He was highly successful. And then he embezzled money from the post office and was jailed, despite the fact that the sum involved was minuscule. He paid it back by the time of the trial. But he was jailed for 6 months. And of course, that then derailed his life very significantly. I grew up in a fairly small town called Campbelltown, which is right out on the Kintyre Peninsula. So it's a small, narrow community. And my father's fall from grace, obviously, was something that was known to everyone. And he then, I think, had to move to Corby. The details around that are fairly vague for me, but I grew up with my mother. We lived in an apartment with my grandfather, relatively ordinary background. I went to school like most people do. Apparently it's a common experience. And I seemed to do reasonably well at that. There were no great expectations of me. So it was a case of I kept going, and if I got my O-levels in Scottish terms, then I could stay on and do my hires, again, Scottish qualification. I got my hires, and I got enough to get to university, and that's what I did. And that changed everything for me. I went to Edinburgh. Miraculously, despite the numerous distractions that I indulged in, my total lack of application and disorganisation, I somehow managed to finish up with a mediocre degree, which was probably more than I deserved. I had no idea what I was going to do at that point. So I went to teacher training college, basically to buy myself a bit of time. But when I began teaching practice, I discovered that it was something that I really enjoyed, and also it was something that I seemed to have some aptitude for. And that's when I began to become more passionate about education.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing, David. Yeah, when you were talking about university there, I was resonating. It's like, yeah, I somehow managed to sort of mug my way through it despite the drinking and the distractions and all that sort of stuff. But it's great that you kindled that passion for education and start to help shape things for you. And thank you for sharing about your family as well. Your father, very sad to hear, when you said that fall from grace and that you had to move and the impact on your family. So yeah, thank you for sharing that with me. Yeah, from your early years and things like that. What do you think you sort of brought out with you into the world? This you clicked with education, but was there anything that you've unpicked now looking back that was really sort of motivating you, driving you into that?
I guess what happened with me in lots of ways was that I grew up as an only child. My mother worked. I discovered what somebody recently described in The Guardian as interiority. I, I, I lived a lot inside my head. I became, I think, quite analytical in that sense. I was very fortunate in that I was encouraged by an English teacher to go to the library. I often tell this story. Discovered that you could go there and take books out and it didn't cost anything as long as you got them back in time. And I started off reading D.H. Lawrence on account of the notoriety of Lady Chatterley's Lover. And I read that, not necessarily from beginning to end, but I got through all of it eventually. And then that triggered a passion. So I read widely, and I always say the same thing about it. It took me from being the inhabitant of a small, isolated town to becoming somebody that was much more widely interested. So I engaged with that. I also somehow or other discovered music. I was passionate about folk and blues music at that stage. That led me to an interest in Ewan MacColl. I became interested in politics as well. So I became somebody who wanted to discover more. And in a sense, I guess what I wanted to do is kind of reinvent myself in some way to try and discover who I was. I'm not sure that I've managed to do that, but I made that effort, I think, and that led me to engage with lots of literature, lots of non-fiction writing. I became interested in history, obviously, which is what my degree was in, and that made me open to all sorts of influences. And partly, before I discovered the passion for education, I discovered, I suppose, a passion for social justice, for equality, for the quest to just kind of make things better. And also, I'm very old, Chris, and I grew up in I was born at the end of the 40s, grew up through 50s into 60s. So obviously, I was growing up during a period where that kind of alternative society, if you like, was very much on the agenda. People were asking lots of questions, lots of exploration, not only in terms of ideas, but also in terms of experience. And I kind of got pretty carried away with that. I'm essentially a very shallow, easily influenced person and got drawn into whatever was going on at the time. And then when I discovered that aptitude that I talked about for teaching and that interest in it, then all of the other interests and passions kind of coalesced around that.
Thanks, David. Yeah, I can hear so much in that. With particularly with that one teacher who helped you find the library, find books, and I often share about a teacher at my second boarding school when I was 10, 11, who was life changing. Because I think particularly in the work that I do, hear an awful lot about the bad ones, the ones who did great harm to young people. But it's very important to recognise the ones that change lives, because there'll be many more of those than there are the other way around.
Yeah.
Yeah, life changing. Then the book started to open your mind. You started to sort of come out of that small town, out of the only child, but also the music. So you and McCall, I think you shared folk and blues. Yeah, I think for me that was very similar actually. It was the more political side. I got very into Bob Dylan and listening to kind of Joni Mitchell and things like that, where I was starting to listen more about what was wrong and right in the world, and as a young man getting quite angry about that, about what was wrong, and starting to want to do something about it, and it stayed with me for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And similar trajectory from, I was really interested in musicians like Bert Jansch, John Renbourn, Ewan McCall, listened to all the radio ballads, that type of thing. And obviously, I can still remember hearing Dylan for the first time on Radio Luxembourg, late at night, God on our side, and being completely blown away by that, and then becoming engaged around that whole political side of music as well.
Yeah, that's cool. Thanks. And obviously, you find your way out, with a real aptitude for it. What you had an amazing career in education, as I sort of talked about in the introduction. You just tell us a little bit about how you journeyed through education and kind of what some of the areas that you worked in.
Yeah, well, I journeyed through education basically in a series of mistakes, mishaps, and confusions. I started off, I was offered the job amazingly, and I went and taught in Dunfermline, and I taught in the same school for 10 years. And I was very tempted at that point just to become a dominee, as we say in Scotland, that teacher that was known, that was kind of part of the school, part of the community. I got promoted. Eventually, I was a principal teacher, or I say eventually, probably pretty early on, I was the principal teacher. And after 10 years, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And at that point, I applied for a move to a different school to see if I could do it all over again. By the time I left that school in Dunfermline, I was well established. Kids coming in knew me. It was very much a case of, you're Mr. C. My big brother's told me about you. My sister's told me about you. And I wanted to see if I could do that again. That wasn't the best idea I've ever had. So I took a secondment and was involved in some national development work. While I was in secondment, the local authority I was seconded from completely forgot about me. So I didn't have a job to go back to. And I was assigned to the advisory service. So I worked in assessment and research at that point. And then I was desperately trying to find a job. Applied for an assistant head's job, got that, and loved that. I was in Kirkcaldy High School, strangely enough, in Kirkcaldy, and I was there for about 5 years. Absolutely loved it. And then we got a change of head teacher and deputy head teacher. I applied for both jobs, got neither. And there was a lot of tension with the incoming leadership team. I was kind of, I suppose, well established in the school at that time. And I think the deputy found me uncomfortable. And he was a bit dogmatic, I think, and it exploded. We had a major row. I behaved extremely badly. I went the next day to apologise to the head teacher. The apology went badly wrong, and I found myself needing to find another job. So I was just desperate to kind of move on. And the job I got was a senior advisor post in assessment and research again. So I did that, and then inevitably, as happens with these things, the service was restructured. So again, I had to find something else to do, and miraculously, I got an assistant director's post in Fife, and again, enjoyed that very much. I don't think that went too badly wrong. I think I decided that I might be able to do a bit more. So I applied for a head of education post in East Lothian and got that, and absolutely loved it. East Lothian was great to work in. I had a wonderful director, a guy called Alan Blackie, who was a really supportive, permissive leader who encouraged me greatly. And then I wondered if I might be able to make the transition to a director's post. So I applied for one I didn't think I would get, just to see if I liked it and what the kind of geography around it was. And then miraculously, I got the job, and that was fine, grand, and I loved that too. And then I had a massive falling out with a couple of the councillors, and things went really badly wrong. So I eventually finished up getting my notice from that particular local authority. I was too old to get a proper job and too young to give up. So I kind of drifted into consultancy work. Gradually, mainly thanks to the intervention of Tim Brighouse, whom we'll talk about later. I met Tim, and he started telling people in England that I was worth using, and that helped to kind of open up real career possibilities for me. And it's, I think it's reasonable to say it's gone from strength to strength since then.
Amazing. Yeah, thank you for sharing that, David. Yeah, journey through. Yeah, and being so honest as well about where you've had fallouts and setbacks and all the rest of it. Just, without getting into the detail, what are you rucking with people about? What are you conflicting? What are you conflicting about? Is it that you've got a sense of how things need to be and it's not happening? Is it the politics? What kind of gets you going?
The situation with Stirling was that the Conservative members wanted an inquiry into school discipline, and I was reluctant to have that kind of public inquiry because the pressure really was to try and kind of get kids out who were proven demanding or problematic or whatever. And while I could understand the motivation, I had nowhere to put these children. And ultimately, the review was going to be, I think, a frustrating experience for everyone, in that it was going to highlight the problems, but it was also going to highlight the absence of solutions. And my advice strongly to the members was not to go ahead with it, but to leave me and the service to try and make sure that all children across Stirling were getting a good deal and the best possible circumstances for education, rather than make something a massive public issue, if you like. And they weren't happy with that. I felt kind of undermined, I guess, as director, and I made it an issue of principle. I made it a resignation issue. I would have got away with it, but it was a hung council, and the the administration needed the votes for
yeah.
a confidence motion, so they granted the inquiry, and I backed myself into a corner.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think earlier exchanges were often about principle. I think I'm very clear about what the purpose of education should be, and I think I'm very clear in my own mind about what some of the approaches are that are likely to be successful. And I think, when I left Kirkcaldy High, I think there was just a real tension around the way of doing things. I think the deputy in particular wanted a different kind of culture in the school, much more a culture of complicity, sorry, much more a commitment to kind of hierarchy, if you like. I was much more interested in openness, equality, etc., and we just clashed. Um, and
Exactly.
I've calmed down a bit now, but I tended to be fairly volatile at that stage in my life.
No, thank you, David. Yeah, I asked because the next couple of questions I had were around. Well, the first one is it? Appreciate it was over a period of time, but what I've just had a lot of talks recently with a group in Ireland who are looking for um, an apology from the government about the violence and brutality in the state school system in Ireland for decades and decades. Corporal punishment was advocated for, and the schools were brutal. What what was it like in education in Scotland at that time, and where were you differing from the sort of establishment?
Well, when I started, corporal punishment was still used in Scottish schools, and corporal punishment been a common feature of my own school days. I got belted every Friday throughout the whole of my primary 7, the last year of primary school. We would get a dictation, and then anybody whose handwriting wasn't up to snuff or spelling wasn't adequate was belted the following week. So clearly my handwriting was poor, and quite remarkably, Chris, and I know you'll be desperately surprised to hear this, but being hit across the hand with a leather strap every Friday failed to improve my dictation or my handwriting. And I was still getting belted at the end of the year. But yeah, when I started teaching, I was in a school where there were a lot of well-established members of staff and a lot of probationers. That was the mix. So I was far from unique, but in terms of the overriding culture of the school, I was determined not to use the belt. I wanted to treat young people with respect. I was, I had some difficulties with the leadership team in the school. Like most young teachers, I made lots of mistakes. I got myself into difficult situations from time to time. But one of the things I was rebuked for, I remember, was I'd been noted saying hello to pupils in the corridor sometimes before they'd said hello to me, which I hadn't previously realised was a cardinal offence. And so I guess, I was trying to create a much more open culture in my classroom. I was trying experimental approaches to teaching and learning, using a lot of practical approaches. I was very committed to the wider curriculum, if you like. I took football teams. I was involved a lot in extracurricular activities. I ran theatre trips, that type of thing. And that wasn't part of the culture of the school. And to be fair, I was eventually kind of allowed to get on with it. And I think probably along with other people in the school, I think we moved that cultural dial significantly.
Yeah, thank you. That's beautiful. It's just lovely to hear it. When you describe being belted every Friday, I mean it, and then you talk about being volatile and angry at times. As you're going through your career, ultimately, if you keep hitting young people, there's going to be anger there, isn't there? And it's not
Yeah,
it's not going to help the handwriting, and it's not going to help later in life. And yeah. So talking to this group in Ireland, they are squarely putting a lot of societal issues at laying it at the floor of the education system, and whether it's alcoholism and societal issues and violence, domestic violence and stuff. Because if you beat children, they get hurt and they get angry. And
yeah. I mean, to be fair, um, I don't think my experience of corporal punishment had that significant an effect on me. I mean, it was very much the norm when I was going through school, particularly when I was going through primary school. So I didn't feel singled out. I didn't feel victimized. I think for lots of people that you deal with and seen and heard, the issue of corporal punishment is much more to do with a kind of uh, sometimes vindictive brutality. Sometimes it's a result of, I think, particularly unpleasant characteristics around those who are inflicting it. I mean, that wasn't my experience. The kind of things that you've dealt with, that I think you're dealing with, Chris, around Edinburgh Academy and what happened there, I think is very different. I was being educated by people who thought that was just simply the way to do things, and I don't think they were quite into this will hurt me more than it hurts you.
mm,
But
yeah,
I think the experience that I had was kind of fundamentally different from the fairly horrific experiences of corporal punishment that some of the people that you work with have had to face.
mm. Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I think for me, what there are some very severe stuff out there, as you referenced, in all sorts of schools or institutions of all kinds, churches, football, scouts. I had Alex Renton, the journalist, say we're a nation addicted to cover up. We've been covering up disgraceful behaviour in institutions from all areas of it, but for hundreds of years. So it keeps coming out, but ultimately, my belief is that something changes. When you're hit as a child, something changes, and whatever the context. And I think the normalization of it that you just talked, it was normal. It was how it was done. I think that's what stuck around until really the noughties.
Yeah,
Certainly, I mean, I was beaten at school in the 80s. The private schools hung on to it much longer, even after the law had changed in England. And I would love to get onto kind of for so that's how it was in Scotland, and you've had an awful lot of involvement with educational policy, and through your consultancy work. When I look at Scotland now, and I speak to people who are teaching there or who are working in trauma-informed schools in Scotland, or people like Suzanne or wonderful Jerry Diamond, or any of these people who are doing great things in Scotland, it sounds to me more progressive and better set up than English state system. What is your view on that?
yeah. I think it again. I think it's not a simple situation. I do probably more work in England than I do in Scotland now. And I see lots of exceptional practice. I see lots of trauma informed work. I see lots of really good relational practice in English schools. Um, and that's kind of despite the system rather than because of it.
Mm.
And in Scotland, I think you'll see a mixture of practice in schools too. Um, I think the policy position is very much more forward looking than in England. And I think the same would be true in Wales. I think what we're seeing in Wales is a commitment much more to educating the whole child. The early years document in Scotland is called Realising the Ambition, and it's a much more child-centred document. It's got more space for play. The equivalent document in England, very much, I think, written in the rear view mirror. It's all about school readiness. I think, although it does have good qualities as well. But I do think that difference is there. I think where we're struggling is in terms of the realisation of that ambition. You see the same mixture of practice, I think, in Scotland as you do in England. And teaching's hard work. I talk a lot about how much more challenging it is now than it was when I started. My classes were much more homogenous. There were far less issues around mental health, not simply because we were ill-informed and ignored them. I generally think that we were in a society that was more characterised by community and collectivism than we are now. I think the politics of the 70s, the impact of Thatcher neoliberalism has been really, really significant in breaking things down. So I've kind of rambled a bit, I know, away from your point, Chris. I think the system in Scotland is well intentioned. I think the reality may not be significantly different, regardless of where in the United Kingdom you are.
Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you for that summary. I mean, I knew a bit about the legislation stuff, and obviously you're on a podcast with Dr. James Mannion. He's been very involved with what's happening in Wales, launching really whole young person centered or child centered, if you want to call it that, or there's a lot more well-being and welfare boiled into it, and that feels really progressive, I suppose. I know there will be incredible schools, incredible teachers throughout England. It just felt to me like the legislative environment is still very much attainment focused, exam focused. There are progressive schools out there in independent education and state, but my daughter's teenagers going through the grammar school system here, and it's the well-being the token well-being lesson is laughable that in their school, and that they're supposedly quite progressive. So I just don't see it shifting yet around here. Maybe I just don't see enough of it. But what to boil it down for people listening, what do you want to see in education, wherever it is? What do you want for young people?
Well, I think what I want is I want young people to have an opportunity for a curriculum that offers them richness. I would like a curriculum and an experience in schools that gave young people a strong sense of themselves. There's a wonderful comment that Mick Waters and Tim Brighouse made about schools being joyful places, and they talk about schools as communities. And the paragraph finishes with where, I think, not quoting accurately, but where young people learn to think for themselves and act for others. And that's a pretty good ambition, I think, for me. I think young people should come to school to get a wider experience than they get in their own home life, as far as possible. I think we should be offering young people guarantees of experience. I don't think we should be thinking purely in terms of the transfer of knowledge. We need to be thinking much more about opening up the world of culture, the world of sport, the world of activity. I've been very committed for a long time to outdoor education. I chaired the working group in Scotland. We produced a report called Outdoor Connections. The chance for young people to engage with nature, for them to become aware of the challenges that we're facing in terms of the climate crisis, the need for much greater environmental awareness, a much greater sense of how we are part of that ecology. I think all of these elements are absolutely critical. And I think it suited particularly the Conservative Party during the long period of power that they had to have an education system that focused on transfer of knowledge rather than the development of capacity, if you like. And I know that the two are connected, but I think the balance has been got wrong. And my vision would be to move the balance much closer towards that idea of wider awareness, enriched curriculum, broader experience, and an opportunity for young people to become learners fundamentally and thinkers.
Yeah, really powerful words. That speaks to me a lot. I think, seen and heard schools would talk a lot about that EQ, emotional intelligence, not just IQ, not just exams, but as you say, it has suited the system, if you like, for a long, long time to sort of gear people up for exams, university, and the treadmill
Yeah,
of life, if you like, the rat race. It's a more manageable tax base. It's and it keeps people. To me, it keeps the rich rich. Really, it's the system set up for it. So, yeah, that's getting quite political in a way. But the things you talk about as far as just equipping young people with a safety and a passion to learn, and I believe every young person has a gift. Most people though, they have to go through life, have it buried through loads of nonsense, have a breakdown at some point, take off all the nonsense they've been given without their permission, and probably get back to what they should have been doing in the first place. So if anyone's lucky enough to have a breakdown and a breakthrough, that's sort of how it feels. It's like you get rid of all the shoulds and the coulds and the woulds from the people around you when you were young, and you get back on track to what you're here for. So I'd love a system that did that. But what I heard from it as well was that you're very passionate about school. Obviously, what's quite big at the moment and rising is sort of progressive education, homeschooling, hub schooling, world schooling, all these wonderful terms and stuff where young people are receiving development let's say outside of traditional school. What's your view on that?
my view on that is very clear and very strong. I think what we've seen over the last 40, 50 years has been a real undermining of collective institutions. And I think we're now at the stage where school is one of the few common experiences that people have the opportunity to have. And I think we desperately need that. I think you can learn in all sorts of contexts, but there is a need for me for a collective experience for people. I worry that the move towards homeschooling, all of that, panders to the right wing sense of individualism. Individualism has become the sacred concept of neoliberalism. And what we're seeing, I think, is that gradual fragmentation and breakdown. So we don't have a common responsibility for each other. We don't have that sense of connectedness and obligation and so on and so forth. And schools can, at their best, certainly, play a part in providing that, and they're the only things left. I thought it was really powerful when I watched the dramatisation around the girl who was effectively kidnapped by her own family, and there was that whole situation that emerged around that, and there was nothing. There was nothing for people to rally around, and it was the Church of England vicar who became central to unifying that community. But in most instances, we've lost that. And if we lose the school as a kind of central collective institution, I don't know what we have left. And it will, what we talked about earlier, the people who have wealth, who have power, and who have control of the media are difficult enough to rein in as it currently stands. The idea that we had Elon Musk addressing a massive rally in London telling us that violence was coming and that we all needed to fight back and all of that. I mean, that's horrific, absolutely horrific, that we're subjected to that rhetoric, which he is only entitled to do because he's the world's richest man. So where are the alternative institutions that give us the opportunity to come back against that kind of culture and that kind of rhetoric? You know, fascinating. Jimmy Kimmel taken off television in the States, admittedly. But we're going to see that. You know, we've had people out in this country holding up pictures of Charlie Kirk, which will be helpful because they wouldn't recognise him without the pictures, nor have any idea who he was prior to his assassination. You know, that all of that transfer we're getting is terrifying. We're seeing it. We're seeing tolerance. We're seeing commitment to equality and justice being undermined. We're seeing the rule of law being challenged constantly. We need institutions. And if we move away from institutions on the basis that, well, it's better for my kids, then, as I say, we're simply pandering to neoliberalism and that whole political commitment, which I think is a threat to the best of who we are and what we might be.
Well, thank you, David. I can hear your passion there, and a lot of what you said, I do connect with. I think particularly when you said about independence being sort of the centrality for neoliberalism, etc. But for me, I went through the independent school system, and everything within that system was gearing you up to be an army of one, who took what they needed from the world effectively. And for me, my work now, I look at my mission here, and it's about interdependence. So the point at which we understand our position in the web of life, our communities, in civilization, humanity, universe, whatever it is, you understand, you can start to sort of find your place. But for me, it's about connection and compassion. But independence is the opposite of all of that. But I resonate with parents who have just got so jaded by the system, they feel they've got no choice left but to drop out of it. Now, I know the last thing we need is well-educated, passionate parents dropping out of the system with the sharp elbows that can make things better, and they go and buy an education or they homeschool. And we had this lovely sort of exchange on emails about independent schools and whether they should exist or not. So, I gave a view that if they're done in the right way and they are connecting and compassionate and trying to change society for the better, then if the state system's not doing it right now, then the independent school system might have to do that. You had a different view, and I enjoyed our exchange. Can you give me a little bit of a view about where you stand on it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the independent schools might do that if the state system fails. The reality is they will never do it for everyone, unless we have a complete breakdown of the system. And I think, my view would be that people buy into private schools for personal advantage and for familial advantage. And it's that old trope, if you like, about I just want the best for my kids. But the reality is that you're buying the best, if indeed it is the best, for your kids at the expense of others. There is no doubt that people who have gone through the independent system in private schools still have an inordinate hold on the most influential jobs, the most rewarding posts. This is the first government that we have had, I think, that where every member of the cabinet is state educated. The first government where that's the case. And if we go back to the previous government, then that was far from the case. And there is something wrong, I think, with a society that's founded on that kind of hierarchy, if you like, and that ability to translate advantage into further advantage. All of that said, I think you're making really valid points, Chris, about how jaded people are with the system, how many people will have felt let down by what's currently on offer. And I can understand that people want a solution now. It takes a lot to be a Melissa Benn or a Fiona Miller and become a campaigner for really enriching the state system, for really fighting for community-based education, because that takes time. It takes commitment and it takes collectivism. I understand people's frustrations. I'm not arguing that we should be, shutting down options and opportunities for people. But I do think that we need to invest significantly in making sure that the state system is not only more effective than it currently is, both in terms of attainment and achievement, but also in terms of the wider education that I talked about. But I think what we also need to do is we need to invest in making the state system more diverse. I think that we don't offer enough choice within the system. I think we don't have enough breadth in terms of what we offer through schools. I think there is a place for, schools of excellence, schools with specialisms, all of that. I think it's perfectly reasonable that people should have a choice within the state system between a school that's much, much more committed to a relational approach, if you like, to restorative practice or whatever, and that there may be people who'd be more comfortable with the kind of provision that exists in Michaela or wherever else. And I think we need to get that kind of diversity and balance into the system as we move forward as well. Because if private education is the better choice in developmental terms, then one has to respect that. And I think, sadly, what we've seen is that private education has often been the poorer choice in developmental terms. But it still managed to put a lot of very damaged people into significant positions of power and authority where they've been able to cause significant damage to others.
Yeah, I think, David, I mean, I am one of those damaged people, and I've seen it. I've seen it around me. If I look at the way I led my career after coming through the private school system, getting into the rat race, and climbing as high as I could, getting as much money as I could, accumulating this sort of. And when I look back on it after my breakdown, I reflected on it, and I realised I was trying to get high enough so that I couldn't be bullied anymore. And ultimately, so I could, if I needed to be the bully, and that really sent my sort of house of cards crashing down when I realised you can never get high enough. There's always someone above you. There's always someone around you. So,
it's really interesting in that I went to see Make It Happen, the play about the Royal Bank, James Graham's play about the Royal Bank, and the whole thing with Fred Goodwin was about making the bank too big to fail. And of course, it was too big to fail. We finished up bailing it out. We're not allowed to nationalise anything else, but we can nationalise the banks when they need it. We're not allowed to offer benefits and support to those who are struggling or those who've got spare room. But we can certainly rally round and offer the nation's money to those capitalists who have failed significantly to deliver on the promises that they've made. I think it's fascinating, that whole concept of becoming too big to fail, and that idea of continually rising and questing and seeking success. And what you're talking about is the insecurity that drives that for so many people. And that's why the work that you do around the independent sector, I think, is important. Because if it's going to be there, if the system's going to be there and it's going to be part of what we offer, then we need to humanize it as much as possible. We need to make sure that the kind of damage that we've seen writ large in some of the recent scandals that we've had around independent schooling do become a thing of the past.
Yeah, thank you, David. Yeah, that's very much how we see it as well. It's a care-focused approach. So, whilst these systems are in place, there are human beings within them, teachers and students and young people who are at risk. I mean, they're burning out. When speaking to a number of people recently on podcasts and just client work and things, where the days aren't getting any shorter. So these kids are going 7:30. They're going 7:30 to 9:30, 5 to 6 days a week, and the teachers obviously have to be around during this process, and they're doing a 70, 80-hour week, and the whole system's falling apart. Eating disorders, teachers are off with stress, high turnover of staff, and pupils really finding their way very quickly to self-soothing behaviours. Whether it's tech, gaming, drugs. It's not so much the drugs and the booze; it's more behavioural addictions now. But whether it's irrespective of the badge, state, independent, whatever, you're a consultant now, and you like say you see a lot of schools, particularly in England as well. What are people listening? What are you advocating out there, and what are you seeing? So what are you going in and helping them to understand, and what are you trying to move them into?
I think a lot of the time, all I'm doing is trying to get people to scrape the barnacles off, to get back to the ambition and commitment that they had when they came into the system. I think I spend a lot of time, I guess, just trying to get across to people that, I did all right in my career. And I think I stayed pretty true to the values that I came into it with. So it's possible for people to do that. I think I try a lot to highlight what you've talked about, the good practice that's out there, to let people see that sometimes doing the right things is the best way to get the right results. I think I'm trying to encourage people to meet kids where they are, to be less obsessed with labels. I mean, I think, we get too much into the either or discussion in education. I think I'm trying to encourage the either and conversation, where we recognise that, it's knowledge and skills, and that, we need order, but we need warmth. That, that we need to meet kids from where they are. My cliche is that our job in education is to hold a mirror up to young people in which they see a better reflection of themselves than they see when they look in their own, and then to work with them to make that reflection the reality. And I guess that's the kind of, if you like, the overarching theme of what I do. I mean, I do a lot of practical stuff as well, around how one might do that. I'll talk a lot about approaches to self-evaluation and so on, leadership, all of that. But yeah, I guess the fundamental vision is that holding up the mirror, making the better reflection the reality.
That's beautiful. Really feel quite emotional hearing that. I think it wasn't a feature of my education. I don't see it even so many years later in my daughter's education. I'm not seeing it yet, but I know that there are great schools out there, great teachers out there who are doing it. So just hoping that through your work, your podcast, consultancy, that we can start to see that ripple out more and more. I do feel we're on the upswing. What we're seeing in Scotland, what we're seeing in Wales, definitely better than it was. We can all say, oh, it's not perfect. I see the upswing. sort of zoom out and go, okay, that's a lot more trauma informed, or a lot more
Yeah,
or child
yeah,
centered than it was. There's something a name that's come up a couple of times today. I wanted to make sure we talked about before we ran out of time. Was you mentioned Sir Tim Brighouse a couple of times. So
yeah.
who's he, and what's your connection with him?
Right. Well, Tim Brighouse was effectively my hero when I was working, when I was the head of education. And Tim had been, I think, assistant director in Oxfordshire, but really came into his own when he became chief education officer for Birmingham. And he turned Birmingham around in every sense, in terms of attainment, in terms of achievement, but also in terms of approach, culture, and the breadth of education that was offered. Tim pioneered the idea of entitlements for young people. He worked in a way that was inclusive and inspiring. He took people from where they were and made them more. He then moved on after he retired from Birmingham to lead the London Challenge, which was New Labour's effort to try and improve educational outcomes in London. And again, complex, lots of other factors involved, but London is now a beacon in terms of educational achievement in the UK. And a lot of that was due to the London Challenge, the way that Tim led that, the approaches that he took. So, in a sense, that's who he was. I met him at a conference in Northern Ireland. Tim was chairing it. I was speaking at it, and I did my keynote, sat down beside him, and paraphrasing for the benefit of listeners, he told me it was effing brilliant, and that he was going to stop taking on engagements from people and tell them to use me. And I thought that, it was that kind of moment where I thought, right, God, take me now. It's not going to get any better than this. Tim Brighouse just told me I was effing brilliant. Um, and remarkably, that's exactly what he did. I got people coming in saying, "Look, we really want Tim Brighouse for our conference, but he's telling us we have to have you." Um, so he and I then began to work together, and we did lots of work together. We did lots of work for Hayes, the HR company. We produced a booklet, 10 Challenges to Leading a Truly Creative School. We did loads of stuff together. We were a really good mix. I think Tim and I, we complemented one another. Tim was always very proud to say that people thought he was left wing, and then he found me, and I used to describe him as David Cameron with gravitas, and I described myself as Tim Brighouse with added cool. But he was such a good person, such a good person, such a nice person, such a generous person, but also a person of enormous insight and incredible ability and capacity for work. He was just, he was somebody whom, I loved, whom I enjoyed hugely as a friend, as a companion, as a colleague. But right up until Tim's death, he remained somebody who inspired me, and he was my mirror that I looked in and saw a reflection of who I wanted to be.
Beautiful. Thank you, David. Thanks for sharing that. And you worked on the book, didn't you? Unfinished Business, the life and legacy of Sir Tim Brighouse. So that's out there now, isn't it? That book.
It's out there now, and I'm sure we can put in the program notes a discount for people. They'll get 20% off if they buy it.
Right.
I'm enormously proud of the book. When Tim died, I wanted to do something And Suzanne Zeedijk was, again, instrumental in suggesting that maybe we could do a book. But I didn't want it to be an obituary. I didn't want it to be an extended tribute, because that's not what he would have wanted. I wanted it to be a book that celebrated where he had come from and what he'd done, but I also wanted it to be a book that was genuinely about the unfinished business, because Tim was still working right up into his 80s. He was doing important work with young people's conferences around climate change in the months before he died. And he would have wanted something that was dynamic. And I think he'd have been fairly indifferent to it being celebratory. So the book has got the most remarkable collection of contributors. It's got major educationalists, Michael Fullan, John Hattie, Andy Hargreaves, Kevin Collins, a whole litany of education superstars, if you like. It's got politicians from both sides of the political divide. It's got Kenneth Baker, Estelle Morris, it's got David Blunkett, it's got people that worked with Tim, but it's also, and I was really determined that it would have this, it's got class teachers, it's got head teachers, and it's got, I think, one of my favourite chapters, by a guy called Chris Kilkenny. Chris was a looked after young man, grew up in poverty. His mum was a heroin addict. And he and Tim met at a head teachers conference in Essex that I was organising. And the two of them got on like a house on fire. And again, censoring myself for the benefit of the audience, Chris always referred to Tim as the effing legend. And he would say, "Oh, are you seeing the effing legend?" So that's what his chapter's called. And it's not abbreviated, but it celebrates that other element, that ability that Tim had to connect with people at all levels. But the book is, I think it's a combination of tribute and manifesto, if you like. So we've got sections about the open school and about steps that we might take to develop the system further. It's got some of the quotes, and ultimately it finishes with the chapter called "Be More Tim." And I'm very, very grateful to Mick Waters and Steve Munby, who co-edited the book with me. Mick had a long professional and personal relationship with Tim, knew him really well. Tim mentored Steve Munby, who's, again, a very significant educational figure. They've both got chapters, and they were very tolerant co-educators. But we finished the book with that section which asks the question, how can we be more Tim? What are the central elements that Tim brought to all that he did that we can learn from? And that's become very much the mantra of the book, is how do we be more Tim?
Be more Tim. Well, thank you, Dave. Thanks for talking to us about it. I mean, it sounds like a great read, and I'm quite inspired to get my teeth into it after what you said, simply because, as you know, I'm passionate about seeing things change for young people out there, and but also, just in the way that you described how he held you up, put work your way, he gave you that, that was effing brilliant. To me, that's a big part of what I do, compassionate leadership. So I have something called the Compassionate Leader Pathway, which Piers Cross has built as a program, and it's designed around great leaders. They lead by inspiring others. They hold others up. They're not grabbing the glory for themselves. They're not self-protectionism, and sadly, the system has created a lot of leaders out there who are very self-serving and protectionist. But ultimately, what I saw there was someone giving someone else the airtime, giving someone else the incentive and the energy to go and do something. And of course, then if leaders are doing that with others, we have more leaders, we have a better society. So thanks for sharing. It sounds beautiful, and it's a lovely relationship. I can see your passion and connection with him. So we're going to come to an end. We've had a lovely chat. I can't thank you enough for your time, your energy. We'll just leave with some thoughts, perhaps. So, we talked before about this idea, young people being truly seen and heard, and if there are schools out there really serving them, what are your final thoughts for what schools or parents need to be asking for out there in education?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we need to do, I think, is we need to engage with everyone. I mean, we can't change education on its own. The work that you do is fascinating because as long as there is a demand from parents to be able to send their children to independent schools, boarding schools, or whatever, these institutions will exist. There's no doubt around it. So we need to engage. We need to we need to maintain that level of discussion. We need to recover that ambition for collectivism, for interdependency, the phrase that you used earlier, Chris. We need to rekindle that, and then we also need to build and develop that within our schools and institutions. And that means holding up examples. I mean, one of the other things that we've done is we've produced an online course called Taking Behaviour Seriously, which looks at relational practice, if you like. We've done a Scottish version, we've done a primary version for England, and we're now working on a secondary version. And the idea is to have talking heads and inspirational figures, if you like, people like Suzanne, Dave Whittaker, who's a remarkable leader, tremendous character. His book, The Kindness Principle, well worth a read. Other colleagues, Hal Roberts, Deborah Kidd, talking about trauma-informed curriculum. But then we've looked at practice in schools, and we need to do that. We need to let people see that what I talk about and what others talk about can be done, that we can have schools which are compassionate institutions, whereas I've said 2 or 3 times now, young people learn to think for themselves and to act for others. And essentially, it's that simple, and sadly also that difficult.
That difficult, beautiful. Oh, let's finish with that because it's such a nice sign off, David. I love that, to think for themselves and to work for both. Servant leadership, in leadership terms, they call it servant leadership, where a leader is a servant to the organisation and not the sort of Elon Musk that you talked about before, totalitarian leader. So thank you for today, and thank you for your work, your brilliant work over decades with young people, schools, with the book, so Tim Brighouse's book, and for taking the time today. So in the show notes, there will be loads of links for David's work, his podcasts, the book, and the course you mentioned there at the end. But thank you, David. Thank you for your time.
And thanks for having me.
Yeah, no worries. Right, thanks for listening, everybody. Look forward to the next episode. Hope to see you there. Been with David Cameron, and this has been the Seen and Heard podcast, a conversational series. Have a great day.